Hope creates the building blocks of faith.
We have fortunate faith 'cause we're brave, the fortune. And fortunate faith builds the kingdom on earth.
Hi there, I'm life coach practitioner Caitlin Townsend, and welcome to Fortunate Faith. And this is my co-host.
I'm Tom.
And today we are going to talk about psychology and faith and kind of bringing in the different elements of science and how to reconcile it with faith. So, yeah. So because this is our first ever Fortunate Faith, I think we should just introduce ourselves as well. So Tom and I actually met through working in a psychology lab while in university, taking our bachelor's degree in psychology. And we worked with black-capped chickadees, which are a species of bird here in northern Ontario. So yeah, it was a really great experience. I think I don't know
No,
Tom's thoughts, but um,
I got to meet Katie there. That makes it pretty good.
oh, okay, I'll take that. um, yeah, so I worked in the lab for I believe it was 3.5 years, and I don't know how long were you, Tom?
I think it was 2 and a smidge. It was 2 years, and then 2 school years, and then a tiny bit into the next summer.
Okay.
But
So we were both there a fair amount of time because a lot of people pass through kind of like just 1 year at a time. Um, so I think I was there for yeah, I was there for the longest, I think, of anyone who was on
I,
a contract.
I think so too. Yeah. Now that you're bringing it up,
Yeah,
even and Maddie, I think we're only there for 2 years.
yeah. Well, because I was there when the lab, well, right after it first opened. So it was the second set of contracts with Jenna.
Things started to break.
Yeah. Well, we didn't even have birds at that point. We were all field work. Um, so I guess for me, one of the main experiences of working in the lab was kind of getting to see a new sense of creation and how intricate creation really is. So for those of you who don't know, and I'm sorry, Tom, this is going to be a little bit boring for you, but black-capped chickadees, what we were studying was actually their language patterns. So they actually have, in their chickadee call, they have a couple different calls, but their main one is the chickadee-dee-dee that everyone's kind of familiar with. Who knows about chickadees anyways? Everyone in the north is familiar with. And that song is made up, or bird call, it's not a song, there's a difference, but anyways, so it's made up of 4 notes, and it's almost like the human language. So they have 4 notes, they need to appear, A, B, C, and D are the 4 notes. They need to appear in order, but they can drop it different letters, they can repeat. So a call could be like A, D, or BC is also a call. So they can use those to make different, I guess it would be like sentence structures in the English language, which is a pretty neat thing to see, because we often think of creation as simplistic, especially like in Genesis, the order of creation, right? Birds were kind of one of the first, and we see that progression as things getting more complex as they go along, and like human beings being the final product in the last day. So often, I don't know about your experience, Tom, as well, but my experience in churches has kind of been like, oh, the earlier on stuff is very simple, and God, like, not that he didn't put a lot of effort into it, but it's kind of like the surface level stuff and then gets more complex. But working in a bird lab, you really see the intricate detail that he put into creating birds. And especially like later on, there's passages about like the birds of the air, if God feeds the sparrows, how much more will he care for you? And we can kind of write off birds as not being important, which I don't think is what Jesus was saying there. I think he was actually saying, like, look at how much care is for this. There's that much more for you.
And he wasn't trying to put down the sparrow there, I'm sure.
No, no, not at all. No. Yeah, but I think sometimes passages like that kind of give us an excuse, I guess, to overlook some of creation, and that creation stewardship piece doesn't necessarily always come in as richly as it could. You seem very pensive. Did you have a thought on that?
Why do you think it's often that creation gets put down? Do you think it's just because of like the intricacies and everything, like, because I think about the church and I think about people talking about creation, and especially talking about other animals in the animal kingdom. It's hard to get away from evolution in some of these senses. And I feel like when I talk about church and the development of animals, it's always a mixed bag depending on who I talk to. So my head's kind of swirling right now with what angle I'm used to hearing, because I feel like there's so many.
Yeah, that's true as well. I agree. And it really depends on um, how conservative the individuals around you are, or what denomination, what different views are. And it's such a broad topic as well, which can be a really good thing, because we get those different views and can. But
You're absolutely right.
yeah.
I think Chickadee Lab was a great place to witness all these things. Like, for instance, we talk a lot about what it means to be human in society we have forever. One of the things that gets listed is communication. So when you're challenged with another animal who seemingly has the communication ability that you do, maybe not, is using it, we don't really know exactly what chickadees are saying, but they definitely have the diversity in their calls to be able to communicate in the same level we do.
Mm.
It definitely challenges what it means, for other animals to be, for us to be stewards of them, as well as just what it means, what that relationship between us looks like, depending on how you value those other animals, and how you
Yeah.
identify with them, or what separates us, or yeah.
Yeah,
There's
and I
a
think
lot there to be thinking about, and I feel like it was, you're right, a great environment to be learning it.
yeah, and to be challenged in those areas. And one thing, kind of piggybacking off of what you're saying, like the Imagio Deo, which that's not how you pronounce that, but um, it's a
Good for me.
it's a theological term that's just like the image of God, but that's like the Latin for it, which again, I don't know how to, I can spell it, but anyways. So when we think about how we're made in the image of God and like, what does that mean? And again, like communication has been something that's been traditionally kind of put into that boat, but then you see that animals can communicate, or there's like the use of tools as well, and crows have been found to use tools even. And um, there's so many different things that, like, what makes us in the image of God, and what is that actually? And I would say, like, the Bible's very clear on the fact that there is a difference there. We are in the image of God. There's a differentiation between us and animals, but what that actually means, I think we've often got confused about, or maybe we've oversimplified what that means, or we've kind of, I mean, it's one of those huge questions to grapple with. What, right? Like, what does, and theologians have grappled with what the Imagio Deo is in its fullness for like centuries. We've been grappling with it. So maybe it's just because it's such a big thing that we want those simplistic, like, well, we have language, so that's
Just
what makes us.
just speak, just send a message, and that'll be, close enough to the mark. But yeah, no, this Chickadee Lab kind of teaches us that it's not enough to speak, but that there's something about the speaking, or some aspect of it that must be unique to humans if we're uniquely in the image of God.
Mm-hmm. And then kind of going, not quite so much with chickadees, I guess in the winter they do flock, but like herd behavior as well, when you get to like more mammals. And um, often, like, we'll say, well, being in the image of God, it's not good for us to be alone, which the Bible does say that. And I do think human beings need each other, but I think it's even more complex than that, because you have other animals that herd behavior is a central component to how they organize. Um, so, and maybe it's not even one thing, like maybe being made in the image of God is all the things combined that we have.
Yeah, it's some
But
interaction of X and Y that we, can't exactly see. And
mm,
a lot of the times, I feel like whenever I read animal studies, people often use animal studies to try to compare those findings to humans, because you
mm,
can't do these studies with humans, because you can't put humans in a room for a week or
yeah,
something.
kind of unethical, just a little.
But it always occurs to me that there's always something lost. Like when you directly compare chickadee communication to human communication, for example, it's there's a lot of people who do like a one-to-one. Like, these things are the same thing. They seem to have evolved similarly, and why shouldn't we be treating them the same? But does feel like it's losing something whenever somebody does that.
Mm.
And I think it's an easy thing to do in science. I mean, any field of science, really, especially when you're looking at things that can be compared to humans. Maybe less so in physics or
Mm.
something like that. But yeah, we're just trying to find generalist principles that apply to humans. I feel like you lose some of those complex interactions with other things.
Yep, for sure. And and I mean, it's not that those things don't apply to us to some extent, but
Oh, for sure. But like, there's a similar problem right now with gene models, right? Like for the longest time, we were trying to find simple explanations with genes. This gene does this, or this gene does this. But really, like they're getting more onto this now about gene networks and that no gene actually acts alone.
mm-hmm.
That these complex combinations of all these different things that come together to create X or Y.
Yeah.
And I feel like there might be something similar in what it means to be a human. It's not communication, it's not tool use, it's not our social ability. It's some weird complex interaction. And I do worry sometimes that in science and psychology or biology, like behavioral studies, animal studies that try to compare their results to humans or extrapolate results to humans, that
Mm-hmm.
they're losing that sort of complex interaction of all these little things that come together to make people human or not.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and it really, I mean, again, how do you like you can't experiment on humans, so it's like how do you
How do you ever find out what that true result is?
yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean that's one of the mysteries we got, and that's yeah.
Mhm. Yeah. So, kind of moving a step forward with this, then, with psychology and faith, like I know you get, like you were talking earlier about those broad opinions, even about animals and whatnot, but there's also different views on how to reconcile faith and, say, even counseling or life coaching and um, different things like, especially with pills and things like depression and anxiety within the church, you get everything from we shouldn't be taking pills because we have God and He'll heal you to kind of the far end where pills seem like the only option rather than counseling. And how do we, I guess, not that there's like a concrete answer to this, but what are your views on how we kind of reconcile faith and making use of those tools? I know that's a huge question, but
I mean, I don't think God wants us to stand still and not work for ourselves and just have Him fix our problems.
I would agree with that.
So I don't think the right answer is to ignore all of your options and do nothing and just hope that God will intervene for you. So
Yeah.
it's counseling or it's medicine, whatever your problem is, I think acting is something God wants you to do.
hmm
Us to do.
Yeah. And I mean, like, it's good to pray. I would say praying
Sure.
about it is
Yeah.
also good, but I
Yeah. I'm
don't
not saying
think
neglect that.
think praying alone is not the solution to those things. I do think we have to be, and that's almost, I guess it would be like kind of a Wesleyan style to approach to faith, where there's that acting as well as praying and trusting in God, but also acknowledging that we've been given a level of responsibility. And I don't know if that comes down to necessarily free will or what we've been entrusted with, but there's a level, I think, of both there where rather than just sitting and praying away our problems and hoping that God will do something, we pray and then say, okay, what can I do? And it's almost like that analogy where if you see suffering in the world and you just pray for God to alleviate it without actually going out and feeding the poor or feeding the hungry, it's kind of that double-sided thing, right? Like we pray for them, but then we also reach out. And I think we need to do that for ourselves as well, right? So
Yeah.
with psychology and that, like these tools have been given to us and this knowledge has been revealed to us as to how to help people. And of course, we do that imperfectly, anyone who's in the space. So I work as a life coach practitioner. I mentioned that earlier. So I'm not in the counseling space per se, but those different things, like we have these tools now and we can use them to better our mental well-being. Um, and I think God has revealed those things to us for a reason and to take advantage of it. But yeah.
So sometimes the way that I view it is, you're praying for something and God needs to have some avenue to make a change.
Hmm.
Doing X or Y, taking a medicine, going to life coaching gives him another avenue that he can successfully fix your problems.
Yeah.
Why not give him as many good avenues might as he can?
Yeah. And for one person, one like pills don't always work for everybody, or coaching or counseling doesn't always work for everybody either. So it's like um, being open to those different options to see where God's going to be working in your particular life and how He's going to step into that space, and allowing Him kind of the opportunity to do that. Not that He needs like permission, He's God, but He's also asked us to invite Him into these things, right? So rather than just sitting there, I really like that view, Tom, like having the different
Yeah.
ways.
Well, like there's I don't know, probably some limited set of ways that'll work with God's plan. Why not make sure that one, give you the best chance of having one of those ways, uh,
Yeah.
those avenues fit into God's plan. So
And I think
more
too,
avenues does that.
mhm. And I think for all of us, often we like a lot of people view life as like this, oh, I got to get the right path, right? But I think for most of us, God kind of has like, it's like hiking in the woods, but you're not on a set trail. You just want to get up the mountain, right? And you can take whichever route to get there, and that's fine as long as you don't wander off the cliff of the side of the mountain before you get to the summit. So with that in mind, kind of those different I want to say channels, but I know that has different connotations, but there's different methods that God can work in your life. He could be working in all of them in different ways. And then some of them might be for you personally off the side of the cliff, but for other people, they might be within the bounds of the woods that they're kind of venturing through, right? So, and the more different ones we take, the more we can see like where that is and where we're connecting with God through that process as well, I think.
Yep.
It's a very broad topic, I guess. um, but yeah, I don't know. So in terms of, you guys don't know, but Tom is getting his master's currently in psychology. And yeah, in terms of being a graduate student, because I only ever did my undergrad in psychology, and then I went to seminary after that for my master's. But what's it like to kind of reconcile faith in that context where you're kind of at the next level of psychology, I guess?
Well, it's not done in public in grad school, which is an interesting
Mm-hmm.
thing. Faith isn't something you can talk about
Mm-hmm.
uh, openly, at least not about having it.
Yeah.
My supervisor's pretty bad for uh, making fun of anything religious or putting it down. Um, Admittedly, I'm bad at defending it, but I mean, it's kind of my job to be accepted there. And if I am not, then I might not graduate. And it's weirdly political. So
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very political, and that's yeah, and I think what that comes down to too is like how do you, because often when we say like sharing the faith or whatnot, we get this like evangelical interpretation of like street corner sharing, like being very bold about it, right? But it's like how do you live out faith is something we live out every single moment in different ways, and not necessarily having to vocalize or be um, obnoxiously upfront with it. But
yeah.
yeah, and it's
And then there's also like I always question, what would me bringing this up right here, right now, do? What would the outcomes be? Would it push people further away? Would they maybe hear it? And depending on the audience and depending on the time and what we're talking about, it comes up sometimes. But I can tell you, it's 1 in 10.
mm-hmm.
In general, I think there's more in these environments, anyways, in grad school, in these heavy scientific environments, you're more likely by bringing it to the forefront to just polarize people further away from faith,
Mm-hmm.
in my opinion.
Yeah, I think there's a
Right?
lot of truth to that.
they're going to be bringing up a whole bunch of, and there's truth to this just in argument research as well. When people have to bring up a position on something or they feel like they have to defend it, they become more biased towards it.
Mm-hmm.
So if I were to bring up faith and then someone in the room were to have to turn me down, they would be turned away from God even more. Their heart would be hardened even more.
Yeah.
So I always do this little calculus, and I'd say, I think there are like 3 students just in my inner lab who know that I'm a Christian, and I haven't really brought it up too broadly.
Mm-hmm.
And that's true for, I think, the entire psychology community anyways at my school.
Yeah, I would say it's probably a
Yeah,
general
I mean, I'm
trend
sure it can
in,
be broadened a bit more than that, but I'm also sure
yeah.
there are some communities in science that are more accepting. I haven't seen them, but I'm also a little bit closeted over in my psychology department.
Yeah, I really like your point about polarization because there's a whole area of sociology that looks at religion, and they're finding that the longer, I guess it's not true of every educated society, but like an educated society is eventually what starts to happen is like the polarization of faith. So you get people who are like really strongly affiliated and then really strongly not affiliated, and the moderate affiliates kind of disappear from that graph. Um, and yeah, so that not wanting to push people into that space of
At
just
least in those contexts, right? Like,
mhm,
if I know that they're in a context where their supervisor is there, where their other colleagues are there, and where they think it might negatively reflect on them to support a faith position, they're not going to do it. They're going to do the opposite of that. And if they do the opposite of that, they're going to be distanced from God even more. And
yeah,
what am I gaining? Am I just trying to show off that I'm very evangelical, even if it hurts, the Christian movement?
yeah, and
I do
it's not, and like going beyond that, it's not loving to that individual to push them further from God. Like that's not what you want to be doing.
exactly.
And
Yeah.
we know that psychological entrenchment is a thing, which is just a fancy term saying that the more you have to like defend a position, you start to stick with it, even if the opinion is outrageous. Like they've done studies on
Even if
this.
it's proven wrong, yeah. You just
Yeah.
hear the politicians all the time, of course. No, I still support the wall. The wall's great. Yeah.
Yeah. So
Sorry.
so not to get political, we'll jump away from politics a little
Yeah,
bit,
boy,
uh, but
easy to
yeah,
yeah.
sorry, go ahead.
So it's easy to do even on any position, whatever it is.
Yeah,
So,
and yeah, you want to be finding those moments where you can actually have a real conversation with someone without that kind of happening. And in every environment, that's not going to be the case, right? But with the same individual, you might be out for coffee one time with them and be able to, something gets brought up and you can actually say, well, I'm a Christian, and have it in those moments. Like it doesn't have to be every time, screaming at the top of your lungs, like, Jesus, like it's just,
yeah.
that's
And,
not helpful.
everyone in the room, take a side of the room on which side you're on.
Yeah. Yeah.
It can be a bit more fine-tuned, I think, than that.
Hmm. And I think too, in especially in the West, we're very language oriented and like conversational based, whereas in a lot of cultures you can't even admit that you're a Christian, you can get shot and all these different things. So it's learning how to display the faith without words as well, right? And just living in a way that's loving, and people can see Christ through actions, not necessarily through our um, outward declaration of faith.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's hard because, like, even in my community, it's like I totally get. I'm sure there are more Christians than I know of in grad school,
Mm-hmm.
but it is negative for them to bring up to their supervisor to anybody else because they will be devalued, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So even though we're not up against murder, um, it is still hard to try to get past that. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and especially when your degree's on the line potentially, right? Like in some
Yeah.
situations.
When there's one person, of any one person of this group of people can stop you from getting your degree, and it just takes them having a negative opinion, which is such a smoky thing, like it's so you can't hold on to it, you can't grab it. It's yeah.
Yeah. And
Weird changes in the air, just about them having a feeling one way or another, it can be really bad for an individual in grad school. So,
mhm. And
and
especially if you,
that's true in a lot of science. Like, I think that's part of why you see these numbers of scientists that, say 95 or plus percent of scientists in this or that field are atheists or are non-Christian or whatever. And I think part of that is just because they know it'll hurt their career to identify as a believer of anything,
yeah.
whether it's Christianity or something else.
And I think to a degree too, like I think there are several factors there because I also think being a Christian in that environment, I think sometimes people give up and get out of it because you can't fully be who you are, and it's a hard place to be in.
Well, there's
Um,
also just your practice makes who you are a little bit, and if you are constantly in an environment where you're unable to practice,
yeah,
you're never in a relationship where you can talk about it. It kind of goes to the back of your mind, and then it maybe goes a little bit out of your mind and out of your self-identification and out of it's easier to happen in those environments than in environments where you're going to hanging out with your church buddies every few days and you're talking about whatever you read.
hmm yeah, for sure.
I'm not
And
saying an excuse, but if you look at like population levels, of course that number is lower in scientific populations than in others,
yeah,
where faith is more readily accepted.
yeah, and yeah, I think too, like there was also I didn't agree with everything in the movie, so I will say that up front, but there was that movie Expelled that came out like a while back when we would have been still in high school. But there was in the States a lot going on with and it was a lot of underground stuff that they were kind of bringing to the surface, but in academics, if you even suggested the notion of a higher power in certain fields of science, like people weren't getting tenure and were getting like let go from institutions. And I think like again, I didn't agree with everything in the movie, and I think some of it was kind of like hyped up. I think there was more to it in some of the cases, but some of the cases, this stuff actually happens, and people do lose their career over it. And in the academic community, once you're red flagged, like you're not going to get hired elsewhere either. Like it's really difficult to. Um, so I think like it is a very real thing in academic environments.
I think it's more than just academic environments. I
Oh,
think
for
it's
sure.
any sort of subculture where faith isn't valued. Like, for
Mm.
example, I'm hoping to go into a computer science field in a couple of years. And before we started this video, I had to do some like quick calculus of like how much will this hurt me,
Mm.
and I decided I don't really care.
Yeah.
If it hurts me, it hurts me. But like that's totally true in computer science. There's TV episodes about this. Like I'm watching Silicon Valley right now, and there was an episode where somebody got outed as a Christian, and he got kicked
Mm.
off of his board and stuff. And like obviously that's a hyperbole, but it's based on
It's
real
based on
things.
truth.
Yeah,
Yeah. Like it.
like that's why it's funny in this show or why it came up.
Mhm.
It's because it's a real thing.
Yeah. And it's unfortunate, but this stuff happens. But yeah, ultimately it's about choosing your path and what you want to do. And I mean, don't let it stop you, like, because it might not even ever happen to you. Like, you don't know that. And like, even if it does, then at least you tried to be in that field, right? And you tried to go after what you wanted. So,
Yeah, and you also have to think: do you want to work for a company that I'm not so hard done by that I need to work for any company, no matter how biased they are against whoever.
mm,
So I got time. I
yeah,
got yeah, I got the ability to not work for somebody who won't hire Christians.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Which is another like nice thing that we have in our society that some cultures don't have is we have that option. Most of us. I mean, there are some people who just need to take whatever job they can get, and I don't want to undermine that either. But like, a lot of us are in a position of privilege that we can um, kind of not pick and choose, but a little bit of
We
pick
can
and
always choose what we value. If we want to value getting into a job faster, if we want to value making more money over the course of our career, we can usually choose what we get to value.
mm-hmm.
Some people, you're obviously right, don't. If they have to choose to eat or to value something, of course you have to choose to eat. Like, that's
Mm-hmm.
not a choice. And I do think, in some, like in computer science, for example, they don't care quite as much as the academics care. They're a lot, academics are a lot more caring about what your beliefs are. Programmers
Hmm.
don't care about what you're programming.
Yeah.
There's
And
some
then
overlap, obviously, but
and then you get my dad who is in computer science in academics. Which, but I mean, he's switched now, so he's in physics too. So maybe that's why. No, I don't think that's why. I think he just got bored of teaching. I mean, computer science, like programming is always exactly the same. And
every few years the language changes and you have to teach it in a different language, but pretty often the principles will be the same, at least for what
exactly.
that's doing, yeah.
Kind of drawing back to psychology rather than all of academics.
It's
um,
hard. Psychology, and I mean all sciences, but I feel like psychology in particular, it's so hard to not talk about biology or to not talk about these other sides, sociology, when you're
mhm.
talking about psychology.
There's so much overlap. I mean, it's the study of human people, so we do everything, right? So it's like, yeah, there's a lot of overlap there.
Well, one thing I always thought was kind of interesting about psychology and the Bible is that the Bible totally, like, it doesn't say anything as like a psychological principle, but it'll say like these things are good for your faith, and like it's like basic psychological reinforcement theories and stuff like that. Like, talk about your faith, and it'll become stronger. And like, yeah, that's true. And
Mm.
like, it has all these psychological truths in it that are just super interesting. And like, even
Oh,
some
for
kind of
sure.
weird things. Like, we have a center in our brain for snake recognition, which you could totally make an evolutionary case for. But it also is pretty interesting that like main bad guy in the Bible is a snake. Well, at least appears as a snake in one
Mm.
part. And
Yeah.
there's just some interesting psychological themes almost, what
Yeah.
truth as well. Like,
And sorry, go ahead. I didn't.
I don't know, take over.
Um, with the snake thing as well, then it comes down to like, because Genesis can also be interpreted, that passage anyways can be interpreted as poetry. So it's did which came first, the snake or the um I guess
Yeah.
fear of snakes. So is it like a literal passage where it was a snake, or is it more we put Satan into that representation because there is such that strong it highlights through like poetry form the severity of the danger of Satan. And it's like which is, and I'm not taking a side for either position, but there are different interpretations as to how that Genesis passage should be viewed. So I think that there's something there for sure, but it's which way are we approaching it? One other thing that I wanted to jump to, unless you had a comment on that first, um, was you were saying like the passages that are like talk about your faith strengthens. There's also like that passage that talks about like talk about good things, and it's kind of like that positivity mindset, and that's something that we use a lot in coaching is that forward moving, think of the good and don't focus on the bad, because if you focus on the bad it becomes like stronger and bigger, and those yeah, that principle of like focus on the good, talk about good things, don't talk about like the negative, like avoid like trauma bonding, and be focused on the good that's happening in our lives. So
And at least what you can do. And like, there's even that, I've been hearing it all over the place, like, say three things that you're happy about today at the end of each day or something like
mm-hmm.
that, those sort of things.
Gratitude
Like, those
practices.
could be almost biblical for you.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and that, especially like the book of Proverbs too has a lot of little small snippets in it that is just like, oh, this is like very valuable.
Yeah, I
And
heard this in Psych 204.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it's very interesting how true it is to human behavior.
Mhm.
I don't really, yeah, it's an interesting thing to reconcile.
See, my view, and like I know a lot of people have different views on the Bible, but um, I'm kind of like God created us. He knows us the best, so of course He's gonna like shove those things in there. Um, but yeah, I think they're there for a reason, and
I just have to think about like somebody who isn't faith based though. Like, I don't know, my supervisor, for example, trying to read this, and you get to some stories, and why is that there? Like, why did they have this so well worded, and this is true. I read this in a study last week, and I don't know. I try to think about that perspective
And
sometimes. Like, is it just like refinement over very many years until they got down to the truth? But we know humans are really bad at that. That we're really good at inferring causality where it's not. So how come? Sorry, it's interesting to
no,
think.
it is. And I think like, and again, obviously I would say that it's evidence for
Yeah, no,
God, right?
I
But
absolutely agree. I absolutely agree. I
but
mean,
I sorry, go ahead.
yeah, I mean, like whenever you read something like that, like I know when I was coming to my faith a couple of years ago now, that was something that like stuck in my head for forever. Was like, why are all of these truths in here? And I'm sure it's true outside of psychology as well. But the ones I knew were in psychology because I just did an undergrad in it.
Yeah.
And so, like, trying to reconcile why those were there and so consistent, and that was something that totally I could never do without God. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And and again, I would say that it's absolutely like a testament to who God is and the fact that he wanted to communicate with us. But from outsiders' perspective, because you were saying like how would somebody view that who's not a Christian, the consensus that I have heard, well, different things, different views, but one of them is that like, well, society, we have this mindset in society that we're progressing, but that idea that maybe we're not, and they actually were as far along as we are, and they just were writing these stories to show these things that they were picking up on. Um,
What do you mean as far along as we are?
well, after the Enlightenment, things started to kind of like, we have this view that society is always progressing and getting better and improving and getting more knowledge and um, all those kinds of views. And it's kind of debated as to whether or not that's true, how true it is.
Well, we definitely know more things. We know more things today than we did yesterday. Whether
Yeah.
or not it's some professor just in one school who knows the extra thing, I don't know how well we disseminating it. I don't know, but as a population, we definitely know more things.
Yeah, but
We
it's
we,
like,
we know more about the Bible today than we did 300 years ago, right? Like
mhm.
we definitely know more.
But I
Are
think
we
it's,
different, or are we more moral, or something like that? I think is maybe a different question.
mhm,
But
yeah. But being that so much of what's in the Bible is like moral based, you could say they recognized these things even though they didn't have the psychology to go with it yet, right? But again, this is kind of playing devil's advocate because I'm with you where I see it and I'm like, wow, like God knows what he's talking about. But I'm just saying like things that I've heard from people who aren't of the faith and that.
so I'm sorry, I'm not sure I understand the position. They
So they
say,
back then they had all the, like, we'll call it like knowledge of psychology, but it wasn't knowledge of psychology. It was just like they recognized the human behavior patterns happening around them and unfolding, and wrote down stories that reflected those patterns.
well, I think it's fair to say that there's innate human behavior, right? Like there are
Mm-hmm.
things that humans are naturally inclined to do anyways. Not that all humans will do them or that all humans will do them in all environments, but people are inclined to care about those close to them, for example.
Mm-hmm.
On average, people like their mom. Whether or not you love her or it's to a different degree, but if you saw her in trouble, you might help. That might be something that we could predict on average would happen. Um, and I think the argument that I usually hear is that these morals are things that you can naturally absorb in the environment or they're innate.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think the faith argument against them is that okay, well, why are they innate to you, and who put them there, and I think that makes them a little bit not innate.
Yeah.
But why do you have them? Well, why do you want to go help mom? Is it just evolutionary? Why do we do some things that don't appear to be evolutionary, or at least we can't explain?
Mm-hmm.
So that is a small subset.
Or like, why are most people willing to risk a life for a baby that's not even theirs, or like that they don't even know? But if they see a baby in trouble, usually you're willing to put your life on the line for that baby, even though, especially like evolutionary, like, yeah, for a species, you're protecting the herd,
Main
but
argument, right, is that we evolved as a species, and that species, it was that social evolution or
but
community evolution.
there's also like the idea with evolution, you want your genes to be like the ones that get passed on, right? So it's actually beneficial in some ways for that baby to die. Not that I'm advocating for letting babies die, but like
It's a complex
some,
formula, I think, because you have to have, if you are a community who is entirely that way, then you're going to fail to a community that's more like ours. And then in that case, that community who is working together is actually the one who overall has their genes passed on. And the community that's cutthroat for, just their own genes won't, even though they were more cutthroat for their own genes.
that's true.
I
But
mean, and
it,
this like complex interactions of everything makes it really hard to say anything causally. I don't know if it's even possible. So,
for sure.
why do you think scientific communities do have such a hard time with faith relative to, and academic scientifics, particularly academia, seem to have such a hard time with faith? And I think that's particularly a problem for me because it seems to me that someone who is in science, they're not really affected. Like if they're not, faith based or anything, they don't really have to think about it. It doesn't really come up in their day to day, right?
Yeah.
Like there's not on their list of things for explanations for things. Why is it that science, more than computer science, more than any other career or field, seems to just not be able to, like, it's been a centuries long effort to try to reconcile science and faith. Why does it seem people are failing?
Yeah, I mean, obviously I don't have like a concrete
No, I
answer
mean,
for
I
like
think it's a pretty
why,
important question to some
but
degree, otherwise someone would have done it, right?
hmm I think a lot of it comes down to not being able to use the scientific language to explain phenomenon that's kind of like out there or seen as like crazy. Um, and not that I don't think it's crazy, but like there's that unexplainable, it's almost like dismissed because if you can't explain it in the language that's available to you, how do you like,
Touch it at all? How do you interact with it at all?
yeah, exactly. And I think major problem with kind of from our end with Christians, Christian language is heavily outdated, especially in terms of um, there's so many negative connotations around certain words within Christianity because there was the whole like Constantine era and moving like the faith forward, and it got used in a lot of negative ways for power, for authority, for ways that it, I mean, like anything, right? It's used for good and bad, and the faith has been used for bad. Um, so it's how do you reclaim that language or get at the meaning of the original language and change those terms so that people can enter into an actual conversation? Because there's so much like Christianese around what the faith is. And I don't know, like, you're relative, like you've only been a Christian for 2 years now, something like that. So like you're relatively new compared to like I grew up in the church, and like even though I wasn't a Christian for a while, and kind of left and everything, I was familiar with the terminology when I was trying to grapple with whether or not I wanted the faith. So I knew the terms, I knew what the individuals using them meant by it, and not what that broader kind of historical um, tainted version of it was, right? So I think to a degree we really need to reevaluate like how we're talking about these things and how inaccessible the language actually is to the general public now. Um, because I think that makes a huge difference into how people interact with faith, into how whether or not they see it as valid. And yeah, so I think we really need to start with re-exploring the language, and how we approach different concepts within the faith and how we're displaying those. So I would say that's where to start. I don't think it's a solution in and of itself, but I think that that's one thing we do need to reevaluate, and to also learn how to use the science and the language of science in that as well. Because there is a lot of evidence for things in science, for stuff that's talked about in the faith or in the Bible even, um, and even just some traditions that have been passed down. And I'm not saying to hold on to every tradition. I think that traditionalism can be dangerous in of itself, but I do think there's some value in there. But it's a matter of articulating it and learning how to articulate it, and to use the language of science to express those same themes, if that makes sense.
To just try to make them seem less other to each other, essentially.
Yeah,
Let's show
yeah.
them where they are similar.
And
Hey,
like,
point out, you guys agree here.
well, and even where they're vastly different, being able to access it through language that is actually showing how they're different rather than these, it's really easy. Like, so for example, in science, especially in psychology, you always need to define your variables and what they mean, because one variable can mean 5 different things in 5 different studies.
Yeah.
And sometimes it can mean 5 different things in 3 different studies if they're using it in different contexts. Like language, I think science does a really good job of laying it out there. So I think sometimes when we're using terms to the science community, they have a different view on what that term even means. And even if it is something different that we're talking about than what they believe, their interpretation of what we're talking about is so far out from what we're actually talking about that it's really hard to even build that bridge or have that level of respect for the different belief, because it sounds so out there or so bizarre or so inaccessible that they don't even know what we're talking about. Because I actually think, for the most part, the science community actually does a pretty good job of respecting other views, even if they don't agree with them. But if you can't articulate them in a way that says, I have evidence for this, and it doesn't have to be evidence that they agree with, but I think that's where we fail, is we're using these terms that suggest we don't have any evidence in our lives for what we believe, and it's just kind of like, or this idea that, oh, you just have to have faith. Well, like, what does that mean? But like, if you actually break faith down, and it's like, well, I've spent time grappling with this and thinking through it. It's not like faith was this thing that just came out of the air and we're like, oh, I'm just going to blindly trust, which to a lot of people, the term faith means just blindly trust. And I don't think that that's, and I think there's like moments for where you have to grapple with your faith and just trust, even though you can't fully see. But I don't think faith is complete blindness. I don't think at any point, like if you follow the life of Jesus and how he lays things out and shows people, like, yes, he gets frustrated at times because he's like, you're still not seeing, but I don't think he's ever leaving people completely blind. Like, he does the miracles and then he gets frustrated that they don't make the connection between that sign and the fact that he's God and like stuff like that. And he's very patient with them. I don't mean to say that he gets like super frustrated and angry, but like I think we have taken faith to be this completely blind thing, which when you look at how Jesus interacted with people, his first sentence to people was not, I'm God, believe me. And that would be more like blind faith, right? But he actually demonstrates and
Give some evidence, and
yeah, and brings them to a place of being able to build up their faith. Whereas I think one of the main things that the science community has difficulty with is that term faith. And I think as Christians, we've gotten it really wrong in some circumstances. And we kind of just like throw it out there like this tagline, like, oh, you just have to have faith. Like, if someone's struggling enough, it's like, oh, have more faith. And
and especially when you
yeah.
have a community like the scientific community, which is 97%, or I don't know what it's at right now, but ever increasingly unfaithful or unreligious in any sense. These terms are not being explained to anybody in these contexts, or at least not at a level that is effective.
Yeah.
So I really do think you're right. And if people were to, like, for example, compare their faith in that Jesus existed to the faith that Alexander the Great existed, for example, and you're to ask why they believe Alexander the Great lived, but not Jesus. It's one thing, like, and I have had this conversation, like, with some people. do you believe that Jesus existed at all, whether or not he was God? And some people will say no.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to wonder, like, why? Like, because we have a lot more evidence for Jesus at least existing
Mm-hmm.
than we do for many ancient figures, like
Yeah.
Alexander the Great's a great example, because we have lots of secondary writings from him, but nothing even original.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that there's just obviously some culture of just identifying it as religious and saying, oh no, that's not for me, and the lack of communication there is something I think, yeah, it is important. People don't say the word faith in Alexander the Great, they just believe that he exists.
Yeah.
But to some level there is a faith there,
There's
you believe that he is
exactly.
not just um, a story made up by ancient people or anything like that. And I think there's sufficient evidence to have good faith that Alexander the Great existed, but I think there's good faith to have to believe that Jesus existed as well.
Mm-hmm.
And why those two things are treated as different, I think, is very interesting. And I don't know if it's obviously some cultural thing. I don't know what level to attribute it to,
Well,
historical, or just current social interactions, or language, as you were saying. People in science are unlikely to ever say they had faith in a theory or in a hypothesis, but that's generally what they're doing. They're
mm-hmm.
making little leaps.
Yeah. And I think that's where the disconnect of the language comes, right? Because if we're using faith in that context, but they don't use that term because that's not how they see the term faith. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so switching those language patterns and getting like there's so much with meeting people where they are, whereas I feel like the Christian culture, and again that term, like we don't even have a Christian culture anymore, but we want people to meet us where we are because for so many years we were privileged with being so intricate in the culture, but that's not the case anymore, and I think we haven't really let go of that yet. So rather than, like, if you look at the life of Jesus, he's constantly stepping into people's lives and meeting them where they're at. The language style he uses is different between different people. I was in a Bible study a couple days ago and we were talking about, like, Jesus before Pilate speaks a language of power and authority because Pilate's in a position of authority and power and he understands it. Whereas that's very different than when Jesus is at the well with the Samaritan woman, and the language he uses with her is very more accessible to her, and like his style of speaking is different depending on who he's with, and he really meets people where they are and with what they understand. Whereas I feel like Christians in North America have this expectation that people are going to come and meet us where we are, and it's kind of like that privilege still. We haven't let go of that privilege that we used to have, and we expect people to um,
Yeah,
to
we don't have to relate to you, come relate to us.
exactly, yeah. Yeah, and we would never say it that way, and I don't think that it's necessarily something we do completely consciously. I think a little bit of it is subconsciously, but it's definitely playing out where we want that respect of the privilege rather than us coming on equal level and going, okay, where are you at? Where can I meet you at? And like, and we don't even, it's a false privilege because we don't even have that privilege anymore, but we're still acting like we do. So I think that that's really problematic.
Yeah. To what degree do you think this is a historical issue? Because I'm trying to think, we have so many positive feedback loops now between science and the scientific community, making it less and less oriented towards faith and talks about faith or anything around that. But likewise, I think there's a healthy amount of talk in Christian groups, at least, I don't know about other religions, that are anti-science and are openly anti-science, and not even in any sort of nuanced way, but just science is bad and is trying to lead people away from faith.
Yeah, and I think it comes down to that psychological entrenchment and that polarization again, right? And I think it's happening on both sides. Um, and yeah, I think
Do you
it's
think that started, and is it wholly a historical issue? Is there something still developing in the modern culture that's making this worse? Because we do see these numbers of the overall numbers of religious people in the Western societies is lowering, I believe.
Yep.
In scientific communities, it's lowering at an exponential rate relative to that over the last 20 years or so. Is that something that's just happening now, or is that some result of history, or is that some combination? I'm sure it's some combination, but would you blame one more than the other, or?
I think it's a little bit of everything. So I think like herd behavior comes into it for sure, and you become like the people that you surround yourself with. Like we know there's so much evidence of that. But also like this idea of polarization, I think, is just weeding out that middle ground that maybe never really was of the faith. And because I think, I mean, I like to think that the numbers were higher and there was genuine faith, but there could also be that fact that like those marginal affiliates that were never really wholehearted about the faith are just kind of getting revealed and having to choose a side, right?
Or do you think
Um,
that you were like really in the middle? Like, do you think like they were like, like your middle voters and they were open to being convinced by either side, and maybe just faith is doing a bad job of making their
yeah.
case relative to science? I don't know. Like, because science is, you're right, speaking in a more, they're not always completely understandable, but it's a newer language. It's probably a language that's more associated with what the kids in school these days are hearing.
Mhm.
So maybe that's part of why they're just able to make that argument much better. And that's why anybody in the middle tends to lean that way after some exposure.
Yeah, and I think too, like we've done. I mean, I think regardless, there will always be people that walk away from the faith in that. But like, in terms of my own experience here and whatnot, like I think we do a poor job of getting to the heart of what the faith is. And we make it very political. We make it very like church politics is a whole issue in and of itself, and we make it very. It can be more about what each religious group thinks rather than like coming back to that heart of love that Jesus had for the people around him, and that love of God. It becomes about, do you believe the right doctrine? Do you believe the wrong doctrine? And we have all these like fragmented denominations who are fighting with each other in and of themselves, and not all of them, but like like you get that a lot where churches are like, well, they don't believe this, or like they don't agree with us on this, so they're not true Christians. Like that, the fact that that is even a statement that gets thrown around, true Christians, you're either Christian or you're not. There's no like this whole, we're like better Christians than these other Christians, is so problematic. And I think people just get tired of fighting, and like it's not a representation of who Christ was, so they look at that and go, this isn't the God that I serve. And if this isn't the God that I serve, does that God even exist? And it becomes that questioning that then sometimes lands them to believe no. Or like for myself, it was like, I believe there is a God, but do I believe that the church is representing that God? And when you decide no, you end up stepping away from Christianity um, because we're not always the best representation of who God is and the life of Christ. Like we're supposed to be emulating that, but do we always? And of course, we're always going to get it a little bit wrong. We're human, but I think that because we had that position in society for so long, where we were kind of privileged, and Christianity was just expected within Western society for many years, we've kind of gotten away from the heart of it, I think, a bit. And,
What occurs to me, especially as we're talking about these people who were previously maybe in the middle, they weren't extremely one way or the other, and things seem to be polarizing right now. Generally polarizing people away from Christianity or
mm-hmm.
faiths. It occurs to me like, what's the easier path for people? Where will they be more accepted based on, these are people who probably are having a hard time in their faith if they were in the middle. They maybe haven't been doing everything right. if they try to get back in touch with their faith, how much resistance or blowback are they going to be receiving from a church community? And
Oh,
how
for
much are
sure.
they going to be receiving from choosing to unadopt their faith and go hang out with their friends who will love them no matter what? And why is that
Yeah.
the non-Christian people? And how sad
Yeah.
is that?
Yeah, it's really sad and really disappointing, but I know like for me, coming back to the faith too, and like I had a good support group and like I appreciate all of them, but there is that level of, oh, you have to rebuild because like what you're doing is wrong, and like that you just need acceptance and that love, and it's not always what you get. And like I ended up coming back because I didn't see another option, and so those things kind of didn't really impact me, but I
Well, think
going
about basic incentive structures. You're looking across, like if you're an economist and you're trying to see, like, okay, we're trying to optimize for X or Y. The current situation looks like you're trying to optimize away from faith because the hardest path for people to take is to go back. The easy path is to go away.
mhm.
Of course, more people are going to lean towards going away.
Yeah, yeah,
You made it really hard to go back. Why? Why are you surprised that
yeah.
why
And
is the faith community surprised that it's lowering
and then we
population?
and like when you look at the story of the prodigal son and like the father just running out, he doesn't ask for like forgive, like he doesn't ask him to ask for forgiveness. He doesn't expect
Get on his
anything.
knees and grovel? No,
Yeah, he just embraces his son and is like, "Hey, you're
it's your
back."
son.
And I mean, for all he knew, he didn't know why the son was heading home. He could have been heading home to ask for more money. Like, and meanwhile, as Christians, when people come back, we're like,
Oh, it's
"Okay,
time to
you gotta."
judge. Put your judge pants on.
Yeah, exactly. And like, "Oh, you gotta get your life in order." And like, "Oh, we love you, but this is what you need to do in order to take those steps to regrow and get everything back to order."
Not
Whereas, like,
you to help or anything like that.
mhm, and
It
in that,
really is sad. And I think like these incentives sort of style structures that I'm talking about, I think that's another problem just relating to science and faith as well, is you have a lot of kids today growing up trying to reconcile these two things.
mhm,
And if the church just says that science is evil, it's not really giving people the right context to frame. They make it look like a decision,
mhm,
which
yeah.
science is at fault for a little bit as well. And they're saying, well, what evidence do you have for X or Y? And they don't really present the evidence for the Bible, so they just say, oh, what evidence do you have? None. Well, I'm not going to tell you any, but make a decision. Faith is just as bad in saying that science is just evil.
Oh,
And
for sure. And
it makes people make this stupid choice between science and faith when there's no reason to be doing this.
exactly. And I
And
think the main problem with that too is like um Christians are supposed to have that third option, right? That third way. The like when Jesus came, he completely shook everything up and took a path nobody expected. He didn't take like the side of the underdogs really, and he didn't take the side of power. Like he created a whole new thing. And if we are to emulate that in our own lives, we should be the ones, we shouldn't expect it of the scientific community to say, hey, we can do both. It should be the Christians to take that step and say, actually, science reflects God and reflects the beauty and majesty of God and like his creation. And it should be, I think it's our responsibility personally to make that step and to say it can be both.
well, I think at the very least, if we're not the ones who are going to take responsibility, do you expect them to? Because otherwise, nothing's going to change. If you want things to
Exactly.
change, you have to be the ones to do something.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Yeah, and I think to your point about kids too, a lot of kids now are actually being raised in secular environments. Um, so they might not even hear stories of the faith, whereas before, like 20 years ago, people, even if you didn't attend church, you knew the stories of like Jonah, you knew the story of Adam and Eve. You might not have fully understood like how it makes sense in a faith context, but you knew it. It was around. We're getting really far away from that. But again, Christians still have that interpretation that we have this place of privilege where if we mention these stories, people should know what they are. Like even me in this podcast, I've mentioned how many without actually explaining what they are or using accessible language for people who don't know what they are. And this is a little different because it's meant to be a faith podcast, but like we're doing that in the context of outreach as well, which doesn't make any sense because again, it comes down to that inaccessible language. And if you're outreaching to someone being like, oh, well, like Adam and Eve, like they don't know who those people are anymore. You can't do that. We have to switch up our whole approach and just like shake it up and start something completely new because that's not going to work anymore. Um, and yeah.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. I mean, between the like kids' environment at school, the way science is presenting faith is bad, but obviously we can't do anything about that from the side of faith. Um, but we're really incentivizing, doing everything we can to incentivize people away from faith, and it's you know maybe good because the people who are still around are the ones who have put through every single incentive against it. But like, man, that's not the goal. You're not trying to just see who's the hardest. That's yeah.
Yeah.
There needs to be some there. I don't know what the answer is though. When things are so big and institutional, it just becomes so daunting to try to touch. It can be just like almost demoralizing and daunting to try to face these sort of size of institutional problems, and I think that's part of why they aren't addressed, is because you have to do some population level change. But
Well, and I think it starts small, right? It starts with the
yeah,
ground up and our everyday interactions. Like something like I was saying earlier about like the language patterns, like even if the church at large is not using those language patterns, when we're talking to people who don't know God, we can switch up our own language patterns and really start using words that listening to what words they're using, and what's accessible to them, and working with their own language patterns. I think.
I think a good way to do that is like some sort of hybridization, like just talking about the science that is in the Bible, or talking about the faith that is in science, or trying to find these overlapping fields where people can make a step into the other world, see it's okay, and then step back if they want to, or whatever they're comfortable with. I've thought a little bit about starting up a like sort of Bible study, but like science oriented.
That would be cool.
Be very debatey, I'm sure, but I
Yeah.
like that. So
I was going to use the word, it would be kind of academic, but debate works.
well, I mean, what are you going to talk about? There's going to be some things that have been politicized. So, but I think
And
that's good to try to get some of the politics away from it. To just try to, as a group, come to some consensus outside of whatever has been politicized.
yeah, for sure.
Like, I know when I first went to grad school, I had some like highfalutin ideas of, oh, I'm gonna talk about religion in a way that's really gonna reach some people, and
It doesn't pan out that way.
it's a bit harder than I was thinking.
Yeah. And I mean, like,
It's any good problem.
sometimes we need that over optimism to,
To start on it at all.
yeah. But I think it's really comes down to looking for those key moments and choosing your battles. I think part of the problem with moving into new language as well is that the church chastise people within it that use different language, right? So if I start referring to God differently, or even like one thing that came up in one of my classes for, I think it was one of my theology classes, but anyways, in seminary, was this idea that we talk about God as male, but he is actually genderless because he's a spirit. And this idea that there are illustrations in the Bible for God as mother as well. Even like Jesus saying, there's one passage where he's like, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how I've longed to gather you together like a hen gathers her chicks, or there's different imagery like that. There's also like nursing imagery, and different things like that. So God is both father and mother. So there is a new movement. One of the questions we were asked for our discussion groups was, well, do we use gender-specific pronouns for God? And some people do refer to God now as mother instead of father. And then there's also the side where should we be using they, their for God? And there are a lot of churches that if you start to do stuff like ultimately, it doesn't matter because God is
Well,
still God. And certain churches will you're not a Christian if you do that, or they jump on each other. So sorry, go ahead. What?
I said that's always good. That's always helpful.
Yeah. Um, so people within their own congregations can't grapple with these things, and even for me, I might, and this is just hypothetical, but if I was struggling with that and wanted to start calling God mother as well, I might even get through that journey and at the end decide, well, he refers to himself as male, so I'm going to refer to him as male. But if I can't go through that journey and you're going to jump on me for not being a Christian as I try and process all this, am I going to stick around, or am I going to go where my thoughts actually matter, and where I can have my own thoughts rather than, and I think because in Christian communities we get scared that, oh, they're going to fall away from the faith, but really we're not having faith in God to get someone through those different journeys that we view. And at the end of the day, for something like this, I don't think God cares whether we call him male or female. He might care, but it's not going to determine whether or not we get into heaven. So does it matter? It's a minute detail that probably doesn't.
Well, I feel like a really big problem with this is what I can totally picture happening is somebody tells you that's not in the Bible, Katie. You absolutely should not be doing this. This is whatever and improper. But they won't actually talk to you about why.
That's true too. Yeah.
They won't actually say it's very a lot of the imagery here. It's the male force is one that we talk about as one that builds or speaks things into existence, and we try to have that theme going along. It's more of a theme than they don't get into this at all. Mm-hmm. They would just say bad.
Yeah, for sure.
I had a similar talk about evolution with the former pastor of the church that I go to, and if you can't tell somebody why, they're not going to change their mind. They're just going to go talk to someone other than you because you're not willing to listen to them.
Yeah, and I think
if it's going to be a scientist or someone who's not religious, then they're going to get those ideas instead of yours. Mm-hmm. A lot of people talk about the risk of changing the Bible or changing the word or changing a message or trying to interpret something from a message, all these things where you might be improperly morphing something. Well, let's be real here. Our Bible's in English now. It's already a little bit morphed.
Yeah.
You also have to think about the counter risks, right? Mm-hmm. What's the risk of having a population that can't experiment with ideas in the Bible, that can't try to think about things and try to maneuver these things?
And I think when it comes down to the Word of God, if we have faith and trust in God, the Word of God is going to stay how God wants it to stay, regardless of that process of grappling through all of that, right? And working through those things. But if our faith in God is that small that we can't even work out our faith, then that's a problem, because we need to really trust God to get us through that process. And maybe not us personally, but as we see people walk through those processes, to come alongside them and say, hey, you're thinking that, I don't know, for that one, in terms of evolution and faith, you want those two things to fit together. Let me walk alongside you in that, and rather than tell you what to think, kind of walk with you through that. And when you ask my opinion, I might give it, but respectfully let you have your process rather than me controlling your process, which really is us playing God rather than trusting God to work that out in the person's life.
Yeah. And I mean, that all of this will also lead, it's going to lead people away from faith. It's going to lead people towards a lukewarm faith, which will lead them away from faith. It's going to lead towards Christians who don't think about what they're reading, but just try, the people who do stay are going to be ones who just don't think about it, because that's difficult in the church. They're not going to get any answers. They're just going to get reprimanded. Yeah. Do you want to have a whole whole congregation of people who isn't thinking about the words they're reading, like,
And to me, that's not faith, that's believing someone else. You're following a leader then, or like a church, or like a
oh,
denomination.
just following Sundays I go to church. I don't know.
Mhm. Yeah, like,
Not active in it. It's hard. I have a hard time picturing how that would work.
mhm. Yeah, and I think that's again one of the things with this term faith, right? Like, if our faith is our own, we have to have those moments where we work through it and figure out what we believe, not what the people around us believe. And I think that's a part of faith and a part of working it out and growing in it. But we don't want, it's almost like the church doesn't want growth in faith. We want everybody to have faith and stay where they are so that they don't risk losing it. But the thing is, that's not, like, you need to have those conversations and that enrichment in order to grow in it. And it leads to someplace beautiful, but we're just not willing to risk the journey to get there for fear that people will fall off. And you know what? In some they might, but they might not have been saved to begin with. Then they're like they're just there along for the ride, and if they can't actually go through the ride, they'll never know where they actually stand, right? And yeah, I think it can be healthy sometimes for people. Like, for example, I came to terms with the fact that I didn't actually have a real faith. It wasn't my own. I left the church for several years, but I ended up coming back as a result. But if I hadn't have ever left, I would have been in the church, but not actually a Christian and not actually of faith. So
Yeah,
would that have been healthy?
that brought you back.
Pardon?
So then you might not have had these experiences that brought you back in a more real way.
Yeah. So I might have never left church, I might have stayed, but would I have ever known Christ and God and had the relationship with him that I do today? No. I would argue I probably wouldn't. Like, maybe he would have got to me another way, but it would not be what it is today unless I had done that. So I think the church really needs to let go and trust God and trust his ability to bring people to where they need to be, rather than trying to have that control and force them to stay and believe certain things. Like, we just need to have trust in God's process, I think, and the refining process of where he needs to take us and where he needs to let us wander off to. um, because his heart, I'm sure, is not for me to have done some of the stuff I've done, but he used it for good.
Yeah.
And as people, we wouldn't have put Christ on a cross, but God did, because it was part of the journey that needed to happen in order to get us to where we are. And I think that makes a huge difference when we can have that level of acceptance of the journey and the bad parts and the difficult things that need to happen and the falling away and the temporary darkness before the resurrection. So, which of course is easier said than done, because I have friends who have stepped away from the faith and you're always like, what's going on for this person? And it can be really hard to trust and not want to have control. But I think, again, it comes down to, we want to be our own gods and have that control rather than trust God.
Well, I mean, I think there is also like a certain level of maybe not control is the right word, but of influence that you can have in those kind
Oh,
of
for sure. For
just
sure.
knowing your friend and knowing what's best for them,
Mm-hmm.
and generally, I think just doing things that are good for them that are also, reminiscent of good Christian things is usually.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm definitely not saying not to have influence. Sorry.
But oftentimes that's just loving them.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, so definitely have influence, but I think it's those, like, as soon as someone starts to tell you what to think, that's not love. If you're telling someone what they need to think, that's not loving them.
No.
And that there's a difference between supporting and, again, that sense of control. If you're trying to control what someone thinks and believes and how they view the faith, you're not wanting them to have faith, you're wanting them to have your faith. And I
Yeah,
think,
sort of coercive sort of influence, and there's a more supportive sort of influence.
for sure. And I think sometimes, like, and like, not in all marriages, but like, I've done a lot of marriage coaching as well. And I think this can come up in marriages, right? Because two people have their own faith and then you're coming together as one, but it can be really hard for them not to want to be 100% the same faith. And I think that's where a lot of conflict comes into view, and they butt heads because their interpretation of what faith is their faith, not what their spouse's faith is. And to learn to kind of, like, I think that's a really good place for people to learn how to just have that acceptance that faith looks different for everybody and that it's still faith and they're still a Christian. And I've seen a lot of people struggle with that because they're told in not every denomination, but some denominations very much press this find someone who believes what you believe. And yes, that's good to an extent, but like you're not going to find someone who's 100% you. And I would argue that it's probably unhealthy to be with someone who's 100% you because there's no
Feel
growth in that.
yeah, to learn how to accept other people a little bit better.
Well, and just in terms of like the whole point of, well, part of marriage is that you're stronger together, right? And if you're exactly the same person, well, why do you need each other? Like, and not that like you need each other because
More
we
arms
have to
for
be God.
balance.
Yeah. Yeah.
No, I know what you're saying though, and yeah, no, there's a lot of room to grow. I think, and when people come together like that, you,
Hmm.
you easily identify who is the strengths of both sides and try to bring them together.
Yeah. And so kind of taking that now to the church, I think we've lost, we look at the term unity and what we think is uniformity, which those are two very different things. And I think that's where a lot of the problem comes in because we can't unify around things that we disagree on when we should be able to, as long as they're not core. Like if you believe Jesus is God, if you believe that He died for us, then like that's core faith. But on the other issues, you should be able to unify within the same church body around having a difference opinion of whether or not women can speak, around having a difference of opinion on whether or not we baptize by dunking or the spritzing water. Like those things.
Any given passages, poetry or history.
Yeah, exactly. So those different things. And yeah, we should be able to unify around them, but often churches don't because what they have in their mind for unity is uniformity, which is not the same thing. And it's not what I would argue it's not what Christ stood for. He stood for unity of the church, not uniformity.
Why do you think there is this big push towards uniformity? Because it doesn't occur to me that this is an inherently, like if you were making a church, this isn't something you'd put on your list of things you really want to have.
Hmm.
So like
That's a
what
good point.
forces do you think promote that?
I think that comes down to a little bit of historical context and the fact that for so many years the church was used to keep people in line, and that allegiance to the king or queen. And I don't think it's now conscious. I think it's something that kind of in the church's DNA has been passed on, so to speak, and we've just never fully addressed it, or maybe it's just that we don't know how to address it as well, because I wouldn't know where to start with that. But I think it comes down to that generational. It's been passed down. Not that the church physically has DNA, but like it's been passed down through the structures and the, like I would say argue like the church's spiritual DNA, that we've kind of grabbed onto these ideas and are sticking with them even though they may not make the most sense anymore.
Because it occurs to me like I don't even know how I would do that. Like, let's say I one day have kids and my son comes home and tells me that he has a different interpretation of something in the Bible than I do. I don't know if I could tell him he's wrong. Like, I don't know if I could prove that, or like, oh, so why do you think that? That's interesting. I always thought it was this way. Like,
Hmm.
what what brings somebody to be like, oh, my reaction should be to get my interpretation into them.
Yeah, and I think part
What
of it,
is there? Like, is it because like maybe at one point in my life it was really useful for me to have my interpretation, and so I want them to have my interpretation?
well, I think part of it too is kind of like with the Protestant Reformation and that when Protestants broke off from the Catholic Church, there was a lot of pressure to get it right and not mess up again. And I think what's happened is we just keep fragmenting down and down further and further because everyone's trying to get it 100% fully right. But I really like, I think it was John Wesley who said, like, we're not going to be 100% accurate in our faith, but the goal is to be 100% accurate, or try and be what we think is 100% accurate in each area. But we know that we're wrong about something somewhere along the lines. Like our faith
We
is,
have English Bibles. Well, what do you want?
yeah,
Like, we're not going to be perfect in anything. Even if our interpretations of our words are perfect, the translation is probably faulty in some spot, or
yeah.
missing, not quite capturing the language of the original translation. Or
Well, and especially like there are some words in Greek and Hebrew that cannot be translated to
exactly.
English directly. Like and you really lose out on some of the enrichment there. So unless you're going to teach yourself how to speak or how to read Greek and
And even
Hebrew,
then, you're not going to learn how to read Greek in the context that this was originally written.
yeah,
So
yeah,
maybe these words have slightly different connotations. Maybe whatever fish they're talking about in some paragraph was bad in some years when this was written, and so this actually means it's bad fish.
mhm,
Like there's so many nuances that we're just trying to be perfect. I mean, try, but
mhm.
expect to fall short.
But yeah, and I think we also need to have a level of acceptance that we're not ever going to get there. We're not going to have that 100%, and that it comes down to humility, I think, um, and acceptance of our own. Like we're supposed to emulate Jesus, not be Jesus. And I think that makes a difference. And like obviously we're trying to grow and become more like him, but I don't think to expect to ever be him, um, like we're going to be wrong about something.
Yeah.
It's going to happen. It's our human flaw.
Do you think it's just like a big push towards having the perfect interpretation and having everything right, and that's why people are so opposed to the introductions of these sort of new interpretations or new ideas when they do come up?
I think it's a mix of things. I don't think people ever do things for one reason, right? Like we're humans, we're complex. So I
Yeah,
think that's part of it, but I also think it's that we also have a fear of anything new. Um, and I think too, they often feel like you're trying to change the word of God, which is not what you're doing. You're trying to um, interpret as it would have been interpreted in the day, but we're so far removed that it's hard to do that.
yeah.
Um,
Seems to me like this whole never change a word that my father wrote sort of spirit that I sometimes see in the Bible, or in the church community, not the Bible. Um, like my grandpa thought it was this way, therefore it's this way, and no arguments. It seems to me just to be like a really conservative move to never get anything wrong ever. If we
mhm,
just never adapt anything, then we'll be close to whatever my grandpa said, anyways, and he was happy with it.
yeah, and
And that has less risk, and yeah, there's a total failure to assess the risk of being this amorphous body, because that's not what.
mhm.
Oh, sorry, yeah, amorphous body, because that's never what we were meant to be.
And I think too, where you also see that come into play is when like missionary work, because oftentimes the gospel is it fits into any context. But the problem is that we've westernized it so much that often now when missionaries go over, they're what they're also taking is Western culture with them. They're not just taking the gospel in and of itself. And I think we get really caught up on our version of it. um, and it allows us to kind of hide from where we might be wrong. If everybody believes that same thing, then our interpretation is right and we don't have to change anything. Um, so yeah, I think it comes down to like having the humility to embrace other cultures and have the dialogue with them too, so they can point out our blind spots, because everybody has blind spots. And I think with the church wanting uniformity, it allows them to ignore blind spots. And not have to deal with those blind spots, because they can be hard to deal with when they come up. And when you realize that you've had a blind spot, like sometimes you really have to reshape things or reshape the way you're thinking, and it's uncomfortable. So being able to have that uniformity allows you to never have to face those things that you don't want to face because they're a little bit uncomfortable and difficult to deal with.
Yeah, it really is just missing the ongoing risk of not changing, though. There's
Mm-hmm.
also risk to picking a university when you're graduating from high school.
Yeah.
You might be going to a bad school, you might be going to a good school, but if you never choose to go to a school, you're losing out as well.
Yeah.
Like you can't just choose to never move forward, because eventually time will keep moving.
Yeah.
And similarly, like we can choose whether or not it's good or bad. We can choose not to ever change or make a decision on if it's okay to interpret a passage this way, or if it's okay to reinterpret something for this culture. But if we don't, then we're just going to keep shrinking, and that's also a risk. And geez, if you don't value that at the same level as you value maybe getting something a little bit wrong for a bit, then you really don't see the whole picture of the risk, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
I think
Yeah.
that, especially like with all these numbers I've been hearing about in Western cultures about the decline of Christianity, it's that has to be more important than calling God they or he.
Yeah. 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 And again, like kind of along the same lines, I think it comes back to the heart of it, right? Like what is, rather than trying to get everything right, what is the unchangeable? And like identifying that. And to me, that's the two most central ones would be Jesus is God and he died for us, and everything else kind of falls around that. But like if you put everything has that core, there's never going to be any um, I don't think it's necessarily healthy, and I think there's never growth. There's never you're trying to get everything right instead of working through it. And
I mean, if you're trying to talk about like all these parables or whatever with a new village, you're trying to like some missionaries have gone to a fishing village, for example. There's a lot of farming language that might need to be reinterpreted for them.
yeah,
If you don't, a lot less people are going to find God. What is the
yeah,
great risk here? Is that you might not do the farming parable quite as well as you do the fishing one, or that people won't hear the word of God. Like, come on, do some
mhm.
relative risk calculations here.
Yeah, I was reading in high school about this suggestion that because a lot of missionaries go over and they're like, well, Jesus is the bread of life, or there's that imagery. Well, when you're in Asian cultures, it should actually be like the rice of life, because they don't do bread. Like that's not something, well, they have bread now but like
But even then,
they
I'm sure
they know.
culturally it feels kind of other, right?
Yeah, exactly.
The food that their families have been sustained on for a lot longer is rice. So it
Hmm.
makes sense. This is and even if you try to put it back into the context of um uh like this is the bread, that this is my body, like this is what people will feed on for many generations, and this is the like man, that speaks way better than just making sure it's bread,
Yeah, for
right?
sure.
Like even there, talk about your relative risk. Like you can't underweigh the risk of never changing anything.
Hmm.
It's choosing to never go to school, to never take that risky job. The risk in not doing things is enormous, and humans are so good at ignoring the risk of not doing things.
Yeah, yeah.
That even outside of faith and everything.
And it's like the idea of sins of omission, which is not what you did wrong, but what you didn't do that you could have done,
Yeah,
and you chose not to. And I think that the
so
totally.
it's easy to ignore.
Hmm.
That's
Yeah.
why it's lasted this long. That's why we're having this. At least part of why we're having this big decline in faith in Western societies.
Hmm.
I think it's an easy, it's an easy thing on the individual level to write. On an institutional level, obviously, everything.
Yeah.
A big boat moves slow, turns slowly.
But if everybody starts from the ground, like movements always start ground up, right?
I
And
mean, like especially Christianity must be the perfect example, right?
mm, so yeah. But this has been a very enriching conversation. But
Awesome.
I do have a meeting that I should head to.
Oh,
Um, but
a couple hours later now. All right.
thank you for listening, everybody. We appreciate it. Hope that you got something out of this, and we will see you again soon.